Alright everybody, so in the previous video we talked about direct quotations. So in this video what we're going to talk about is paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is a little bit different than direct quotation, but it still requires that you have citation at the end. So paraphrasing is different than a direct quotation. So for those of you that might not remember from the previous video, we have a statement here that I attributed to a fictional person, a professor at LSU named Bill Smith. And if there is an actual professor at LSU named Bill Smith in the political science department, I apologize. So previously we took a look at what it would entail for you to incorporate this entire statement into a direct quotation, meaning taking it word for word from the author and giving them credit. So again, the statement is, George W. Bush, the Republican candidate, won the presidential election of 2000 thanks to the state of Florida. Okay, so when you paraphrase versus directly quote versus generate new material that you don't have to cite, the difference here is what is common knowledge. Now, common knowledge is broadly defined in the sense that you don't need to cite information that most people, and I put air quotes around that, would know as sort of background information from existing. Like, even if you only ever sat around the house and watched TV, or sat around all the time watching TikTok videos or something like that, there should still be a relative understanding of, okay, like, I understand that grass is green for the most part, unless you go to Kentucky where it does look blue on certain occasions. The sky is blue. George Washington was the first president of the United States. Hydrogen and helium are on the periodic table. Africa is one of the continents of the world. I don't know. The Colosseum is in Rome. London is the capital of Great Britain. You know, all of these things that we would consider to be pretty basic knowledge. You know, if you start getting into, you know, more obscure things like, can you name the two senators from Louisiana that are in the US Senate? That's considered not necessarily common knowledge. You have to know a little bit. I know one of them is a Kennedy. I can't remember what his name is, but yeah, so, you know, it's about what is considered common knowledge and what is considered not common knowledge. Now, if you ever have a question, if what you are writing down is considered common knowledge, I would suggest two courses of action. The first of which would be, I would always cite something if you have a question about it, simply because you can't get in trouble for citing something that doesn't need to be cited. But you can get in trouble with plagiarism, as we mentioned earlier, if you don't cite something. So you're never going to get in trouble for oversighting things for the most part, but underciting can definitely cause some academic integrity issues, student ethic issues, depending on which school you're at. And then the other thing that I would suggest is that you perhaps reach out to your professor, teacher, instructor, the tutoring center, whatever it is, to ask them if they consider something to be common knowledge. But again, going back to the first point, you will not be penalized for oversighting for the most part. You can be severely penalized for underciting something. All right, so when you paraphrase, paraphrasing is different than simply rephrasing things in your own words. So when we take a look, there are specific elements to this that might not be considered public knowledge. Now, depending on your age, you may not have even been alive for the election of 2000. I mean, that's becoming more and more common among our students the older and older I get. So that's okay. But knowing that George W. Bush, unlike his father, George H.W. Bush, who was elected to one term as the President of the United States in 1988, George W. Bush was going up against the Democratic candidate in 2000, Al Gore. Now, the fact that George W. Bush served 2 terms as president is common knowledge for the most part, just depending on who and where you were at that time. If you weren't alive, then chances are that's something that you probably didn't pay a lot of attention to. If you're like me and you were in your late high school years going into college by the time George Bush was finishing up his first term as president, it's pretty hard to ignore that that was common knowledge at the time, simply because he was on TV all the time. 9/11 happened, things like that. So the fact that he was the candidate, that he was the Republican candidate, the election was in 2000, and that the state of Florida held a prominent part in that. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but it was a very, very close election. If I remember correctly, in 2000, Al Gore actually won the popular vote, meaning more people voted for him to be president than George W. Bush, but George W. Bush got more electoral votes. So in the states where, I'm not going to get into the Electoral College, you probably are somewhat familiar with it given the actions of the election of 2020. But essentially, he won states with higher populations. Therefore, even though more people voted for Gore, George Bush became president. But in much the same that we've seen over the last few years, they had to do a recount in Florida. And George W. Bush's brother was actually the governor of Florida when that happened. So you can see how that kind of created some issues if you were not a fan. But anyway, so these parts that I underlined here, the specific candidate, the fact that he was a Republican, the year of the election, and the specific element of the state of Florida, all of that would not be considered common knowledge to most people. The only one that might be would be that Bush was a candidate and that maybe you knew he was a Republican. That would be about it. Anytime you're dealing with actual numbers, be it a date, a year, statistics, a specific calendar date, I'm trying to think what else, anything that would specifically describe someone in a way that would not be just generalized. That's when you start to get into, okay, I am writing this in my own words, but I'm including some very, very, very specific details. So if we were to make this something that didn't have to be cited in our own words, what we would probably do is cross out some specific terms, like 2000. We might cross out the elements of the state of Florida, and then probably reword this. So what we would probably do is say something a little bit less specific. So maybe okay, so, sorry, that could be a little clearer. at the turn of the last century, George W. Bush became president of the United States. So nothing in this would need to be cited. I've taken out all of the specific elements. I don't mention who he was running against. I don't even mention the particular year. I just say at the turn of the last century, which means as the 20th century or the 1900s become the 21st century or the 2000s, that's when George Bush became president of the United States. So I didn't mention anything about the controversy in Florida. I didn't mention anything about Al Gore, who was running against him. I didn't even mention the specific year of the election. I just kind of left it a little bit vague. Now, if you don't want to be citing everything all of the time, then this is an acceptable way of putting your information out there. It's a little bit more, you have to be a little bit more of an editor to make sure that you are keeping very specific things out. But at the end of the day, this is a true factual statement, albeit devoid of a lot of details. It doesn't have a tremendous amount of meat to really dig into in terms of this statement. It's just sort of surface level at, 22 years ago, something like that, George W. Bush became president of the United States. But, it doesn't have to be anything really, really showy. So that's how you take something that has very specific information and put it in your own words to the point where it doesn't need to be cited. Okay, so let's take a look at this real quick and let's put it into a paraphrase situation, which means I'm absorbing what this other person, this fictional professor, Bill Smith, had written, and I don't want to directly quote. I want to incorporate some of the specifics that were in his statement, but I also want to change it around a little bit. So let's take a look at how we could rephrase it using some of the specifics from Bill Smith's own writing. So, okay, so you can notice with a paraphrase, you do not need quotation marks, all right? You're not directly quoting what they're saying. You're taking elements of what they said and turning it into something that is a little bit your own, is a little bit the original wording of the person who wrote it. So I changed the original to running against Al Gore in 2000. So again, we have our specific there, and I added another specific. George W. Bush became the first Republican president since his father, thanks in large part to a recount vote in Florida. All right, so I have the specific elements from the original statement, which means I need citation in here. And I've gone back, if you didn't see the direct quote video, I've gone back to our fictional poli-sci professor, Bill Smith, and the fictional page number of 17 for this. So, again, punctuation for the sentence would come after the citation here. But because I use these specific elements, unlike the last example I just showed you, it requires that I give credit back to the person who originally wrote those specific ideas. And again, you can do what we talked about before, which is, you know, according to Bill Smith, running against Al Gore in 2000, blah, 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 and then you would just have the page number here at the end. Or if there is no page number, which we talked about in the direct quotation video, then you would simply just end the sentence having introduced the author up here. If, of course, you chose not to do that, and there was no page number, you would still come down here and just write Smith. Now, this needs to be done. You need to cite any time that you paraphrase. There are a couple of stipulations that go along with that. So one is if you have a body paragraph in your paper where you have been paraphrasing one source for that entire paper, it is perfectly acceptable to put a citation at the end of the paragraph that indicates that entire paragraph was paraphrased from that one source. However, if you paraphrase from more than one source within the same paragraph, so let's say I have this chapter by Bill Smith that I'm using, and then let's say I have a newspaper article from, Sarah Lee, let's just say. I must be hungry. So if I followed this sentence with a paraphrase or a direct quote from a newspaper columnist named Sarah Lee, I would then need to put in another direct quotation giving her the credit for their own ideas. So you can, if you paraphrase your entire paragraph, quote the entire paragraph or cite the entire paragraph, at the very end. But if you use multiple sources in paraphrase, then each time you switch sources, you need to make sure you have that citation in there. And again, this is in MLA format. We'll talk about APA format in a different video. But for right now, paraphrasing is when you have specific elements from the original quote that you have then sort of reworked with your own words into a unique statement. The specifics require that you give a citation, but the rest of it is your original language. All right, so when it comes to citation, and especially with paraphrasing, if you have a question, cite it. If the professor, teacher, instructor, or a tutor has a problem with you citing too much, let them tell you or ask them if you are citing too much. You can't get dinged too badly grade-wise for citing too much. You can absolutely find yourself in a world of academic hurt if you are constantly taking other people's ideas and not giving them credit. All right, so watch out for that in terms of plagiarism. But when paraphrasing, the difference between generating your own ideas or summarizing and rephrasing something and paraphrasing is simply, do you have specifics from the original direct quotation in your reworded version of it? If you do, then absolutely you are paraphrasing. If you're being more generalized, then you absolutely are summarizing and putting things in your own words and don't require a citation. So just keep that in mind when paraphrasing. Okay? I will see you in the next video and enjoy.